Anyway, you guys know who I am, presumably, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Buck Joffrey. And I want to first of all thank all of you for coming. There's people here from different countries. There's people here from all over the country here. And it's a lot of fun, and we're going to learn some things. But before we get started, I just want to have a few. I want to point out. I just talked about being McCleary, but where's Tim McCleary? Because you guys hear Tim all the time on these webinars. Western Wealth. That's the guy. That's the guy. So make sure you go and talk to him. The other people I want to just point out. Rod and Christian and Ben. Are you guys in here? Maybe not. Okay, Ben's here. There's Rod and Christian. So you guys talk to them a lot of times, so it's probably good to have some knowledge. And they're going to have a booth out there, and also you're going to see Wealthability, Tom Wheelwright's group out there as well. So go ahead and check in there as well. But anyway, I want to start. I'm going to do a relatively quick intro here, just because you're not. I mean, you guys hear me talk all the time. So, and what I'm going to just try to do is just put this in sort of just a paradigm in which we can kind of approach the day. And so I have this idea of this Wealth 2.0, which I've been talking about, and you've heard me talk about pieces of this, but we'll just sort of put it together and use it as a place to start for the rest of the day. So when you talk about Wealth 2.0, of course you got to have a Wealth 1.0, right? So what is Wealth 1.0? Well, there's a couple of them. The ones that obviously we, as a group in the alternative investing space, think of when we think of the old paradigm is the stocks, bonds, and mutual funds stuff, right? And so I'm not really probably going to have too much trouble convincing you guys that this is something that's a little bit of an issue. But let's just review what they say on that side. And you've heard these arguments before. It's that generally you're not intelligent enough to make any investments on your own, so you need to hand your money over to a wealth advisor. And the goal is for them to invest it, and make so much money for you over a period of time that eventually you can live off of 4% per year, and that 4% is going to drive you until you die. That's the dogma. There's a problem with it, though, and the problem is that the historical data, because this is very data-driven, the data used to come up with the 4% rule is at least 20 years old. In fact, it is compiled between 1926 and 1976. That's absolutely true. And it's just, when I read that, I was just astounded. Seriously? We're using that data to determine whether or not we're going to run out of money? Anyway, but the big difference, of course, is that between those times and now is that really, interest rates are at record lows. And most of what those things that 4% is supposed to be made of is fixed income. So bonds, right? You're not going to use a lot of stocks when you're in your 70s and you get, you hit by a big volatile market. So the problem is that since interest rates are at record lows, fixed income is actually going down further and further in yield. So anyway, in order to compensate for that, people are going to have to put in more stocks, and then they're going to have more volatility. It's just a really unstable way to go. And listen, we live in unprecedented times where you just can't use these old models, in my view. I mean, it might work, but if you had someone telling you that you're going to get on a plane and there's a 90% chance you're going to land, you might not get on the plane, right? So then there's this other paradigm, which is the cash flow paradigm, right? And this is kind of, I think those of us who are inspired by Robert Kiyosaki, Tom Wheelwright is obviously here. We talk about cash flow all the time. And the idea is kind of a simple thing where, okay, you invest in cash flowing assets, you accumulate, cash flow, and when you have enough money, right? And then you retire. And it sounds so easy, right? Everybody who reads these books, and myself included, it's like this aha moment. Yeah, that's all I have to do. But the problem is that it's a little bit harder than that, right? It's a little bit easier said than done. In reality, you know, a lot of you, most of you come in from sort of the high income world, or employees, and you have say you have an income of it's $500,000 per year, and you know, the goal, of course, with this paradigm is, okay, I'm going to replace my income over time. You know how much money it takes to, you say 8% per year, you would have to invest over $6 million, $6.25 million. And if you were able to do that $100,000 per year, it would take you 62.5 years to do that. It's just way too long, right? So we need to move quicker. So I'm not saying that the cash flow model in itself is a bad thing. I'm just saying we need to understand that when you do the math, it's not as easy as it sounds, and we got to figure out how to speed it up. The other thing is, for people in this room, is that the cash flow thing sounds great, but the reality is that you guys all make some pretty good money, right? So if you're buying houses, single family houses, and you're getting $200 a month in rent, well, how's that moving the dial at all? It's not. So what else can you do? So that's where Wealth 2.0 is, right? Wealth 2.0 is saying, all right, maybe the cash flow can come a little bit later, but right now I got to focus on creating wealth faster. I have to get there quicker. So how do you create wealth with less money? So you don't have to have 6.25 million to replace 500. Of course, it's simple math, you know, like stuff I'm talking about, I'm simplifying, but well, the secret, you know, this is the key, right? This is the key that wealthy people use all the time. It's the secret of the wealthiest people in the world, how to move quicker. And so, you know, as a doctor, I'm an old student who's good at math and physics and things like that. And I remembered one time looking at Newtonian physics, looking at momentum equals mass times volume. And I'll argue, like, how do you remember that? It's crazy. But yeah, those are the kinds of things I remember. And I was like, you know what? Wealth is kind of like that, right? So the momentum of wealth, it's got to have an equation, because these same sort of themes come up over and over again. And so the way I look at it, and I think it works pretty well, actually, is this idea that wealth, creating wealth, or you know, your ability or your rate of building wealth, has got three variables really, and it's what I'm calling mass, there's velocity, and leverage. And in this case, mass is, I mean, it's just how much money you invest, right? If you don't invest, you ain't gonna make any money, right? I mean, you cannot earn yourself into becoming wealthy. It's just impossible to do. I mean, you don't know how many times I talk to, you know, doctors who've been making $500,000, you know, $750,000 a year, and they've done it for 20 years, and I ask how much they have saved, and it's like $1 million. It's amazing, right? You just can't do it, so it has to be methodical. So you gotta invest. You gotta invest in order to create the wealth. The next variable is velocity. So velocity, I think of, is how quickly your invested capital gets back in your pocket, okay? And it's different from yield. It's a little bit different from yield, because really what we want to do is we want to take the same capital and we want to invest it in multiple places, right? That way we don't have to keep making more and more money. We talked about having to invest 6.25 million to get your 8% and get your $500,000. Well, if you take the same money and you deploy it, get it back, deploy it, get it back, and you're putting it to work in multiple places, that's velocity, and that's what we really want to focus on. And then the last thing is leverage. And this is where we differ significantly, I think, with the Dave Ramseys of the world, et cetera, is that we know that without leverage, it's very, very difficult to become wealthy. It's very difficult. And so what do? We use it in a smart way. We use mortgages, we use, in the form of other people's money, and other kinds of amplification strategies. So in order to create wealth, you must invest as much money as possible. So what are the problems we encounter when we want to do that? Well, you can only invest so much money per year, and you have to pay taxes, right? So a couple of solutions, or a couple of ways to think about how to increase your mass. One is to legally minimize your taxes. And so Tom will be up here later on and talk about that, because it's one of the things that just is astounding. to me, like when I came out of residency talking to CPAs, and there was just nothing I could do to reduce my taxes. I'm like, this is crazy, there's nothing. And then I read Tom's book one day, and I just couldn't believe it. Just completely blew my mind. But he'll talk about that. So if you legalize if you can minimize your taxes, that's one of the ways you can do it. The other way is, again, using velocity. Now we're talking about recycling capital, right? We're not going to just talk about making more money, but we're going to use the same capital. So going back into minimizing taxes, again, Tom says if you want to change your tax, you have to change your facts. So it's sort of like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or something like that, but but it sounds cool. I always, so I come from a small business background as well. I mean, I've really, since finishing training, I've really been more of a business guy than I have a doctor. And, in business, we think about this all the time, right? It's not what you make, but it's what you keep, right? I mean, you have businesses all the time making 10, 20, $30 million in revenue, but who cares if they're profiting like 1%? It doesn't help you. And for personal finance, you got to start thinking about the same way, all right? I don't care if you're making $500,000, $1 million. If you're giving it up, half of it, that's what you actually make. It's not what your, salary says it is. So we really got to focus on profit, not revenue. And again, lowering your taxes to increase your personal profit margin might actually be easier than making more money, right? So the second part, when we talk about recycling capital, actually brings us into the idea of velocity. So if your goal is to replace that $500,000, again, it's going to take way too long if you just do it in a linear fashion. So what's a more efficient way to do it? Let's recycle it. So we talk about infinite returns. So people talk about 10, 15% returns. This is all great, right? But the reality is that infinite returns is even better. We love infinite returns. And it's very possible to achieve this thing called infinite returns in commercial real estate because of two factors. First of all, you have the ability to borrow 70 to 80% of the money for an asset. And the way commercial real estate in particular is valued, okay? It's not valued like a house. It's not valued like somebody looks at it and says, I think I'll pay this much for that because I like it. That's just not the way it works. Commercial real estate is math, right? It's valued not by what somebody thinks, but rather by the net operating income generated by the property. So the nice thing about that is if you drive up the income of the property, you drive up the value of the property. Doesn't matter if it's ugly. If it's making money, somebody's going to want to buy it. So that's great because then it turns into math, right? So infinite returns, again, what's the idea behind infinite returns? Some people think of this, some people are familiar with cash out refi. So people who are flipping houses, for example, do this all the time, right? Put in a little bit of capital, then they get a valuation, and then they pull out their equity. Now they have no initial capital in the deal, and they own an asset. That's infinite returns, right? But it's just a lot easier in some ways to do in commercial real estate because, again, it's math driven. There's no speculation, right? I mean, you drive up net operating income, and that's the beautiful thing. And then you can take that money out and then from that refinance or what we'll talk about a little bit in Dave Steele's model is not quite a refinance, but similar to refinance. And then you just recycle the capital into another investment. So Dave Steele is going to show us how to do this, in a way that typically with his company, you can, within 2 years approximately on average, it's about 50% of capital return within 2 years. And so that really speeds things up, right? So if you put $100,000 into something and less than 2 years later you got 50 grand, you take it out, put it into something else. Meanwhile, this investment continues to go. That's beautiful, right? So what that allows you to do is grow your mass much quicker. And again, that whole issue of income replacement and goals like that become much more realistic. And then there's leverage. And leverage is obvious, right? We talk about leverage all the time with it's basically using bank money, and it amplifies our returns if we do it properly. So it has an obvious use in what we just talked about with leverage appreciation. And it's what allows us to do the whole infinite returns things. And again, it's virtually impossible for most people to become wealthy without leverage. So leverage is ultimately the multiplier in the equation. And that's what really, really speeds things up. And the more smart leverage you can apply, the better. Now, but leverage isn't just bank money, right? What is a lever? A leverage is a lever. It's anything that just helps. You know, it could be your team. For me, Tom Wheelwright is my CPA. He's a lever for me, right? He's helping me to, increase my bottom line. So that is a lever. We talk about wealth formula banking. There's ways to literally double dip your investments there. I mean, that's another type of leverage that we can use by using this simple compound interest arbitrage we talk about all the time. And then there's also leverage in ways that we don't think about. And Jim Sullivan's going to talk about that. For example, with tax deductions. Now, it's a little bit of a controversial topic, and Jim will talk about it, but there's ways potentially to take your charitable giving and leverage up the actual deduction that you get. And that's going to be, I think, a new concept to some of you, and it'll be interesting, and it'll be fun to actually have Tom comment on it as well. So anyway, I don't want to take up more than that time. So this is in conclusion, basically. So it's math. It's math, right? It's, wealth equals mass, velocity. Wealth equals mass times velocity times leverage. And it's all about the math, but then you got to have the right people to plug into variables to make it work, the right assets, et cetera. And that's what people here are going to talk about today. These are the people that become things that you can plug into this equation.